Las Vegas, February 1972. Inside the packed Hilton showroom, more than 2,000 fans were on their feet when Elvis Presley suddenly stopped mid. The band froze. The lights burned hot. What came out of his mouth next left the audience stunned, and some would say, changed forever. The Mid-South Coliseum hummed like a living thing on the evening of July 18, 1972. Over 12,000 fans had packed into every seat, spilling into standing room areas, waving scarves and programs. The scent of popcorn and cigarette smoke clung to the air, mingling with the polished wood floors and the faint metallic temps of the stage lights. Camera flashes flickered like distant lightning, reflecting off the sequins and rhinestones of Elvis Presley's white Adonis jumpsuit as he strode onto the stage. The king's presence was magnetic. Even those in the farthest balcony leaned forward as if gravity itself pulled them toward him. The sweet inspirations hovered behind, their harmonies swelling gently, while James Burton's guitar riff sliced through the anticipation, crisp and electric. The audience collectively held its breath as Elvis leaned into the microphone, a faint sheen of sweat glinting on his temple, his eyes scanning the crowd with a practiced warmth. Yet among the sea of faces, one pair of small, wide eyes seemed to hold the night in suspension. A young orphan girl, Clara, perched on her father figure's lap, clutched a crumpled program with trembling fingers. The bright lights reflected in her tear-filled eyes, and in that instant, she was invisible to no one. Her gaze locked on the stage, and a subtle tension rippled across her small frame, as though the very air held her stillness in place. The arena went dead silent in her presence alone. Though the crowd had not yet noticed, the band launched into the opening bars of Love Me Tender, and the room tilted into the gentle sway of anticipation. Fans sang softly under their breath, voices blending into a low, reverent hum. Ushers moved discreetly through the aisles, corralling restless teenagers, their hands shaking slightly at the sheer volume of human energy pressed into the cavernous hall. The stage lights bounced off sequins and sweat alike, illuminating the king's every movement. Each note carried weight. Each pause, tension as Elvis's voice rose. Warm and tender, the crowd leaned closer, collectively inhaling every syllable. Yet a subtle shift began at the front row, where Clara's gaze fixed unwaveringly on the microphone. Something in her expression, a mixture of awe, fear, and hope, pulled the room's unseen string. The audience felt it subconsciously, an electric undercurrent that threaded between every hand clapping, every foot tapping, every hushed whisper. Something unspoken had begun, a quiet disruption that promised to ripple outward. Reflective question: have you ever felt invisible in a crowd, waiting for one person to notice you? In that split second, Clara's small body seemed to contain the weight of 12,000 souls, and the king, oblivious to nothing, leaned slightly forward, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging her existence in a way the rest of the world could not yet see. And then, just as the first chorus drew near, a subtle tremor of tension passed through the audience, almost unnoticeable at first. But beneath the rhythmic hum of voices and instruments, a faint stir, a whisper of disturbance, hinted that this night would deviate from all others. The king's gaze lingered on Clara, and the moment stretched longer, heavier until the crowd, sensing the pause, began to shift uneasily. Something was about to happen that would transform the night, forever. But one pair of eyes belonging to Clara would soon shift the night's trajectory in a way no one expected. Ballad carried through the Mid-South Coliseum, soft and deliberate, the strings of the orchestra weaving a gentle tension under Elvis's warm vocals. Every note seemed perfectly placed, each one met with a wave of sighs, whispers, and the occasional camera click. Fans leaned forward, mesmerized, and then a small, almost imperceptible sound broke the spell. A muffled cry, shaky and faint, emerged from the front row. Clara, no older than 9, clutched her worn program with trembling hands, her small frame quivering under the weight of the cavernous hall. The cry did not pierce the music so much as seep into it, threading uncertainty into the melody. A nearby fan whispered sharply, shushing her, tension snapping through the section like a taut wire. The arena's atmosphere shifted subtly. The rhythmic hum of voices dimmed as all attention began to pivot toward this fragile anomaly. Elvis's head tilted ever so slightly. His gaze scanned the sea of faces until it settled on her trembling form. The microphone picked up the faintest catch in his breath. A pause so brief, yet so charged, it seemed to draw the entire audience into a collective, suspended heartbeat. The band froze mid-strum, the sweet inspiration's harmonies hanging in the air, unfinished. Even the lights seemed to hold their breath, casting long shadows over the polished floor. The arena went dead silent, thousands of fans united in confusion, awe, and anticipation. No one had expected a moment like this, and yet, instinctively, they felt its weight. Security glanced toward the balcony, then toward the stage, unsure whether to intervene. The colonel, seated just off stage, stiffened in his chair, a hand half raised as if to signal the usual commands. Something was off script. Something had pierced the perfection of the night, and the king, of all people, noticed it first. Reflective question: what would you do in front of thousands if one fragile voice broke your rhythm? The question hung in the charged air, unspoken but palpable. Every fan, every musician, every staff member felt it in the pit of their stomachs. A simple, human interruption demanding acknowledgement. Clara's tiny lips quivered as she attempted to speak again, barely audible even from the first few rows. Yet the king leaned forward, the microphone lowering slightly as if bridging the gap between her smallness and the enormity of the crowd. The arena, packed to capacity, seemed to shrink around them, focusing entirely on a single human connection. The band, sensing the pause, refrained from filling the silence with music, letting it stretch instead a deliberate, sacred emptiness that amplified the gravity of the moment. Some fans shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered encouragement. Cameras clicked sporadically, catching fleeting images of a child and the man she revered. Attention threaded through every row. Would the music continue? Would the king resume? Or would this small voice alter the night entirely? The audience waited, collectively suspended. The energy of thousands balanced on the fragile hinge of human choice. The cry, small but persistent, had already begun to bend the rhythm of the evening. Something extraordinary was in motion, and no one yet knew its conclusion. In that instant, thousands wondered would he ignore her or acknowledge her. The moment stretched, fragile as glass, as the arena held its collective breath. Security began moving in, their polished shoes tapping sharply on the wooden floor, ready to escort Clara from the front row. Their steps were precise, practiced, but tension clung to them like a second skin. The crowd's murmurs rose, a mix of impatience, concern, and awe, creating a low undertone that threaded through the Mid-South Coliseum. Cameras tilted, capturing the tableau of a child frozen, guards advancing, and a king who had stopped mid-song. James Burton's guitar strummed hesitantly. each note tentative, a nervous thread stitching through the uncertainty. The sweet inspirations held their harmonies, voices suspended in the tension of the pause. The audience, once vibrant with applause and whispers, was now muted, hanging on the edge of an unscripted moment. It was as though time itself had slowed. The heat of the spotlights became oppressive. The smell of popcorn and cigarette smoke intensified, and every exhalation from the 12,000-strong crowd seemed amplified. Elvis raised his hand, palm outward, halting the music, halting the approaching guards, halting the flow of every expectation in the room. The gesture, simple but commanding, pulled the room's tension into a single point of focus. Security paused mid-step, unsure if orders had changed. Colonel Parker's eyes narrowed, a hand frozen mid-gesture, astonished at the deviation from protocol. Every staff member, every fan, every musician sensed the gravity. The king had chosen to insert humanity into a performance meticulously, choreographed for perfection. The crowd became a living entity, murmurs vibrating through the hall like waves of electricity. Some whispered in disapproval, "Why pause now?" Others leaned forward, hearts swelling with empathy, sensing a rare display of vulnerability and care. Reflective question: when a legend halts everything, do you lean in or do you pull back? The answer, unspoken yet deeply felt, hovered in the cavernous space. The girl, Clara, trembled, unaware that she had captured not just a man's attention, but the attention of thousands. The arena, packed beyond capacity, had shifted from spectacle to a collective witness, caught between anxiety and anticipation. Every person in that hall became an actor in a drama orchestrated by the simple force of human recognition. Short bursts of silence punctuated by subtle gasps created a rhythm more potent than the music itself. Elvis's eyes never left her face. The pause was deliberate, rhythmic, filled with intent. The king was not merely observing. He was choosing a path. Compassion or protocol, humanity or performance. And the audience, sensing the weight of his decision, leaned inward, their breaths held collectively. The sweet inspirations, usually a backdrop of harmony, leaned forward, voices soft, waiting. The guitar hummed gently, a bridge between suspense and resolution. It was a crossroads that could define the night, a single choice capable of rewriting the memory of the evening. The tension became nearly tangible, a thread pulling at every heart in the room. In this silence, the stakes were higher than any note sung, higher than any applause earned. The king had stopped more than a song. He had stopped time itself. The crowd held its breath, unsure whether anger or mercy would win the night. Elvis walked deliberately to the edge of the stage, the lights catching the glint of rhinestones on his jumpsuit. The microphone squealed slightly as he lowered it, his gaze fixed on the small figure trembling in the front row. Clara, clutching her crumpled program, looked up, wide-eyed and unsure. Every fan in the Mid-South Coliseum leaned forward, sensing that the scripted concert had given way to something profoundly human. His voice, soft but commanding, broke the silence. "What's your name, honey?" The words carried through the cavernous hall, reaching the back rows with a clarity that stunned the audience. Clara whispered, her voice barely audible, and the king crouched slightly, offering her his silk scarf, simple gesture, yet monumental. The crowd gasped collectively. Security froze. The arena had gone dead silent, and in that pause, thousands of hearts synchronized with the rhythm of empathy. "She matters," Elvis said, voice short, deliberate. Tonight she matters. Short bursts of speech. Each word weighed more than any lyric he had ever sung. The sweet inspirations, harmonies hung in suspense, instruments muted as the audience absorbed the depth of the moment. Murmurs rippled, disbelief giving way to awe. 12,000 people, once caught in music's spell, were now caught in compassion's embrace. The king's hands trembled slightly as he knelt, bridging the divide between performer and child. Clara's small fingers brushed the scarf, and in that gesture the concert ceased to be just entertainment. Reflective question: have you ever witnessed someone risk everything to honor another's humanity? Here, in front of thousands, Elvis was making that choice. The crowd responded instinctively, a quiet collective inhale that echoed through the rafters. The tension broke in a subtle wave. The first faint applause rose from a section of the audience, quickly swallowed by the hush of the rest. Some cried silently, others whispered encouragement to Clara, and a few clapped softly, unsure if applause was allowed in this new, sacred rhythm. The band waited. Every note had paused in deference. James Burton's guitar hummed gently, tentative, as if unsure whether to rejoin the unfolding moment. Elvis stood, scarf still in hand, and looked out across the faces now riveted, not by song but by choice. The spotlight caught the glimmer of tears in his eyes, reflections of the crowd's collective humanity. This was not spectacle. It was communion. The choice to stop had transformed the stage into a space where empathy mattered more than performance, where presence outweighed perfection. Short bursts of sentences emphasized the gravity of each action. He crouched. She looked up. He offered. She reached. The crowd watched. The music waited. These words, unspoken to the audience, but alive in the narrative, captured the tension and immediacy of the moment. Silence, then an eruption. The audience, unified in recognition, prepared to transform the night in a way no one would forget. The hush that had settled over the Mid-South Coliseum shattered in a cascade of voices. As the crowd began to chant Clara's name, Clara, Clara, the sound swelled from the front row and echoed through the back seats. A wave of human unity that rolled across all 12,000 attendees. Women passed bouquets forward, their petals brushing the hands of strangers who leaned to share in the moment. A man pressed a worn ticket stub into the girl's trembling hand, a small token of a night now transformed into legend. Elvis, standing center stage with the silk scarf in his hand, allowed himself a brief smile. Then, with a subtle nod to James Burton, the first notes of Love Me Tender resumed, but this time the verses were directed at Clara. The king's voice softened, intimate, bridging performer and audience in a rare, unspoken communion. Each note seemed to carry the pulse of the crowd, every lyric amplified by the empathy that had taken hold. Reflective question: how often does compassion echo louder than performance? The audience leaned forward, some standing entirely, swaying in unison. Mothers cupped children to their chests, men clasped hands, strangers touched shoulders, all bound together by a single act of humanity. Cameras clicked sporadically, yet the moment felt untethered from media, more sacred than spectacle. The sweet inspirations resumed harmonies, their voices now shaded with reverence. The guitar hummed steady, a thread reconnecting the paused music to the shared heartbeat of the audience. Clara, her small fingers entwined with the scarf, swayed with the melody, absorbing each note, each word. The arena was no longer just a place for music. It was a space transformed by collective care. Every clap, Every soft cheer, every whispered "it's okay" became part of the soundtrack of the night. The disruption had become unity. The moment of vulnerability had become a conduit for connection. Elvis allowed the pause to linger between verses, letting the crowd feel the full weight of their shared presence. The King's performance, once defined by rhythm and spectacle, was now defined by empathy, a living testament to the power of human recognition. Even the most cynical spectators felt the shift, a warmth spreading through the hall that had nothing to do with the stage lights. As the final chorus approached, 12,000 voices joined together, singing for Clara, for Elvis, for the shared miracle of attention and care. The chant of her name had become a chorus, and the music, now enriched with audience participation, transcended the original performance. The Mid-South Coliseum, once a house of mere entertainment, had become a cathedral of human connection. The climax of the night had arrived not through virtuoso notes or dramatic flourishes, but through a simple, compassionate pause. The energy, once restless and tense, transformed into catharsis. Every heart in the arena understood. Greatness is measured not only by the perfection of one's craft, but by the choices made in its service. What began as a disruption had transformed into unity, and the night was poised to etch itself into memory as more than just a concert. It was a moment of legend. The next morning, the Mid-South Coliseum had emptied, but the echoes of the previous night lingered in the city of Memphis. Local newspapers chronicled the unprecedented event. Elvis stops show for child, the headlines proclaimed in bold type. Fans, still buzzing from the communal experience, traded bootleg recordings that captured the pause, the scarf, the whispered words that had silenced thousands and then ignited them into unified cheer. The story spread beyond the city, carried in letters, clippings, and whispered conversations that transformed the night into legend. Years later, Clara would recount the experience with a mix of awe and disbelief. The silk scarf pressed into her small hands that night had become a relic of an encounter that transcended the stage. It was a tangible symbol of recognition, a proof that even the smallest voices matter. And while the band moved on, and Elvis performed countless shows in cities across the nation, this moment was cited again and again in memoirs, interviews, and fan tributes as one of his most human acts. The bootleg tape, circulated quietly among devoted fans, became an artifact of legend. Whispered discussions in music shops, fan clubs, and living rooms recounted how Elvis had bent a night of flawless performance toward empathy. Every listener seemed to discover something new upon repeated plays: the pause, the crouch, the careful choice to make one child central to a sea of thousands. The performance was no longer measured in decibels or notes, but in the capacity for compassion. Reflective question: how does one small act of kindness ripple through time, shaping not just a night, but decades of memory? In this case, it was more than music. It became a lesson in human connection. Newspapers ran photographs of Clara clutching her scarf, faces of the crowd blurred behind her but energy visible, a wave of presence frozen in ink. The Memphis Gazette, July 19, 1972, described it as a pause that turned a concert into a communion. Eventually, a small plaque was installed outside the orphanage where Clara grew up. She mattered. Tonight she mattered. Visitors, new generations, and fans of the King alike would stop, read, and reflect on the power of attention and choice. Elvis's words, captured on that night, had become a mantra, a quiet call to humanity that transcended music, Even decades later, historians, biographers, and fans refer to the evening as a turning point in the way audiences understood Elvis Presley not just as a performer, but as a man capable of empathy. The legend endured, not solely because of his hits, but because he stopped, truly stopped, to honor a human life amidst 12,000 witnesses. The ripple extended beyond Memphis, inspiring acts of kindness, the foundation of charitable efforts, and the cultivation of empathy in countless anecdotes shared among fans. What had begun as a simple disruption, child's cry, had grown into a story remembered for generations. A testament to the idea that a moment of humanity can overshadow a lifetime of spectacle. The moment turned legend, shaping how fans remembered his compassion as much as his music, and leaving a legacy far beyond the stage lights. One concert, one child, one pause that changed everything. The Mid-South Coliseum had witnessed more than a performance. It had witnessed a choice, deliberate and compassionate, that echoed far beyond the night itself. In front of 12,000 people, Elvis Presley had demonstrated that legacy is not built solely on talent, accolades, or applause. It is built on the moments when we recognize the humanity in others. Reflective question: when the world is watching, who will you stop for? The pause in a song, the crouch to meet a small gaze, the simple gift of attention. These are the gestures that define a life as much as any achievement. The audience, the city of Memphis, and eventually fans worldwide remembered that night, not for the notes sung but for the courage to stop, to choose compassion over protocol, to let empathy guide action, the scarf given, the whispered words, the eruption of the crowd chanting Clara's name. These were symbols of a transformation that reverberated through decades. Every fan who experienced it carried forward a lesson. Greatness is measured not only by what one accomplishes on stage, but by the choices made in front of those who need recognition, however small or fleeting. And so the pause becomes eternal. The story of Clara, of the King, and of the collective hearts of 12,000 people remains a blueprint for the power of presence, for the way a single act of kindness can ripple outward and shape memory, culture, and legacy. The highest notes fade, but the moments of humanity, whispering to us across time, who will you stop for when it matters most? If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes music can heal and compassion can transform. Were you, or someone you know, at that Memphis show? Tell us your memory in the comments, because moments like this deserve to live on, one story at a time.